lilacs all sparkling with dew.
Thomas Neil Cream was born on May 27, 1850 in Glasgow, Scotland. 4 years after he was born, though, him, his parents, and his 8 other siblings would leave Scotland and immigrate over to Canada. This is where Thomas would get his education, including him enrolling into McGill College in Montreal. He would attend the college for a medical degree, and he would graduate on March 31st, 1876. Soon after his graduation, he would meet Florza Elizabeth Brooks, and the two were intimate, which led to her having an unwanted pregnancy. This would lead Thomas to do his own abortion on Flora, which almost led to her death. Flora's father would soon hear about this, and he was furious at Thomas. So instead of protecting his daughter from the Scoofy Goober, he said that they should get married. Flora's father's wish would be granted, because on September 11th, 1876, they got married. Soon after the marriage, Thomas would travel to England to register as a graduate student at St. Thomas's Hospital. A few years later, Thomas would return to Canada, and he would become an abortionist. He had a good reputation as an abortionist until the body of a young woman named Kate Gardner was found in his office. An investigation was launched, and it was quite obvious with all the evidence they gathered that Thomas was the killer. However, for some reason, Thomas was not charged with the crime despite the evidence that was gathered against him. Because of this crime, Thomas would move to Chicago, Illinois, and start doing his abortions there. In August 1880, a woman by the name of Julia Faulkner would visit Thomas to get an abortion. However, Julia would mysteriously die under unknown circumstances. Thomas would be connected to the murder, however he would get off of the charges again. Thomas would also begin a side business, which was making an elixir to combat epilepsy. He would gain customers for this business, and one of them would be Daniel and Julia Scott, who were in a relationship. However, Thomas and Julia would begin having an affair. Eventually, though, Daniel would become suspicious that the two were having an affair, and once Thomas found this out, he began to add strychnine, which is a poison, to the medication. Unfortunately, this poison would eventually kill Daniel on June 14th, 1881. This time, however, Thomas would be found guilty of the murder and was given a life sentence. This would change though, because he would be released on good behavior on July 31st, 1891. After his release, he would go back to London, and in there he would commit 2 murders. He would go after 2 prostitutes named Matilda Clover and Ellen Donworth, which he would kill by poisoning the 2. He would go on to poisoning 2 more women named Emma Shreville and Alice Marsh, and after the murders he accused his neighbor of the murders. He also said he had evidence against a man by the name of Joseph Harper, and he said if he paid him £1,500 or more, he would not go to the police. However, Joseph refused to pay, and obviously Thomas didn't have any evidence against him, and he eventually gave up. So instead of trying to get money from the case, Thomas decided to start bragging about how much he knows about the case. And to get his point across, he guided tours of the place that the murders took place to 2 people. One of these people he gave a tour to was Police Sergeant McIntyre. This guided tour caused McIntyre to start monitoring Thomas, and eventually he was arrested for 4 murders and an attempt of a 5th murder. His trial would last 5 days, and by the end of it, they decided that he would get the death penalty. He was sentenced to be hanged on November 15th, 1892, and that sentence would be carried out at Newsgate Prison in London. It's 1865 and Charles Kennedy, his wife Rosa, and the couple's 3-year-old son moved to Moreno Valley in New Mexico. Moreno Valley is surrounded by trees and mountains and brought a lot of travelers to check out the area. To take advantage of the amount of travelers, the couple would construct a guest house for the travelers to stay in after they checked out the area. Once it was open, the couple would start getting many customers staying at their guest home. However, these guests would end up never leaving that guest house because Charles would start killing the guests. After he killed them, he would take all their valuables and then burn or bury the bodies. One day, a traveler came to stay at the guest home, and the traveler asked if there were many Indians in these parts. The reason he asked this was because Rosa was Indian. Charles's son, who was 9 years old, said, "Can't you smell the one Papa put under the floor?" This led to Charles killing the traveler, and then he picked up a firework poker and began beating his son with it until he passed out. He would do the same thing to Rosa and then lock her in the house. After this, Charles would leave and begin drinking outside until he passed out. Luckily, Rosa was able to escape and make it to the nearby town called Elizabethtown. She made it to the saloon in town, and in the saloon, 2 men named Clay Allison and Davy Crockett were drinking. Rosa would proceed to tell them about what happened that night, and also told them that her husband was a serial killer. The 2 would go with Rosa back to the cabin, and once they got back, luckily Charles was still passed out, and they carried him back to Elizabethtown to the police. Charles would admit to the police that he killed 21 men. However, it was soon revealed that a judge who was known to be open to bribes would be working on the case. Since the town knew that Charles would easily be able to bribe the judge, they would lead a massive mob to the jail that Charles was staying at, and they broke him out of the jail at gunpoint. After this, Clay, who was part of the mob, would drag Charles behind his horse, and they tied a noose around his neck, and they proceeded to tie it to the horse. Clay would begin to ride his horse along the main street of the town until Charles' head was no longer attached to his body. Clay would then bring the head to the saloon, and he put the head on a stake to show the town what happened to murderers. From what I found, Clay was not charged with murdering Charles. Clay would pass away from a wagon accident on July 3rd, 1887. It is unknown what happened to Rosa and Charles' 9-year-old son. Jesse James was born on September 5th, 1847, which is also my birthday, so that's pretty cool. He was born in Clay County, Missouri, which many years ago his parents Robert and Zerelda, also known as Z, decided to move to. The couple had 4 children, but unfortunately one of them passed away when they were only an infant. Robert would become a pastor at a small Baptist church, and Z stayed at home and would take care of the family's farm. However, in early 1850, during the Gold Rush era, Robert would be asked to travel in a wagon with a bunch of local men and work as a chaplain. Months later, though, it turns out that Robert drank contaminated water, which led to him having a fever. Now, back then, a fever was almost guaranteed to kill you, and unfortunately for Robert, that would be the case. He would be buried in an unmarked grave, and years later Jesse would try to find the grave, but he didn't have any luck. Z would eventually marry a man named Archie Rubin, who worked as a physician. Archie took a place as the father figure, and he taught Jesse and his brother how to ride a horse and how to shoot guns. Jesse was a very generous, bright kid when he was younger, and he liked to prank other people. In 1861, when Jesse was 13 years old, the Civil War began. And only 3 weeks after the war began, his older brother Frank would go in to fight on the Confederate side because the family owned slaves. When Jesse was only 16 years old, he would go into the war on the same side as his brother. Jesse and the Confederate army he joined committed many atrocities, such as the Centralia Massacre. The massacre would kill 122 Union soldiers. He would also be involved in the Lawrence Massacre, which killed around 150 soldiers. In 1865, Jesse would ride into Lexington, Missouri while holding a white flag. A white flag meant in the Civil War the soldier wanted a truce. Jesse would try this, but I think he did something wrong because he got shot in the chest. Somehow, though, he would survive the incident, and afterwards he would go to Nebraska to recover. He would return to Missouri after making a full recovery. Once the war ended, the brothers made a gang called the James Gang, which was a gang of criminals, essentially. Jesse's reason for starting this group is because he hated the industrial North. The gang would start committing crimes like robbing stores in 1866, and it's carried on for another 15 years. During those 15 years, the gang would kill and injure many innocent people. On December 7th, 1869, Jesse would kill a bank teller who was believed to kill Bill Anderson, who was a significant leader during the Civil War. Eventually, Frank would leave the group, and he would begin living a peaceful life. However, Jesse continued his robberies and killings. On September 7th, 1881, Jesse would move his family and his wife Z, who was also his cousin, to St. Joseph, Missouri. Z had been trying to get Jesse to start living a quiet, peaceful life just like his brother. Jesse would finally agree, but he wanted to do one more bank robbery. On April 3rd, 1882, Jesse was planning his robbery with Bob and Charles Ford at his home. While planning though, Jesse noticed that a painting was crooked on his wall, and he decided to grab a chair to stand on to fix it. As he was standing there though, a gunshot would ring out through the house. The two boys looked at the ground at Jesse and saw that their plan had worked. Jesse was 34 years old when he was assassinated. The reason the two brothers did this was to get a $10,000 reward promised by a governor named Tom Crittenden. The brothers would be arrested for the murder, but Tom would pardon them, which means they were cleared from the murder. Frank would say to Charles that he would one day kill him for killing his brother. The stress of fearing his death would cause Charles to take his own in 1884. In 1892, Bob would be in a bar, and while he was there, he was killed. Frank would pass away from natural causes on February 18th, 1915. Boone Helm was born January 28, 1828 in Kentucky, but in his early life, him and his family would move to Missouri. Helm was not the best behaved kid when he was younger. What I mean by not behaving is that it is reported that one time Helm walked his horse into the town's court and just started lecturing the judge while it was in session. If the sheriff would try to arrest him for being psychotic, he would resist the arrest. This type of aggressive behavior would continue on into his adulthood. Boone would eventually marry Lucinda Frances Browning in his early 20s. When Boone would drink though, which was often, he would get into a drunken rage and he would beat Lucinda. This would lead to her getting a divorce from him, and Boone's father Joseph would end up paying for the divorce. It is reported though that the divorce was extremely expensive, which led to Joseph going bankrupt. One day Boone's cousin Little Burry Shute, and I'm not joking, that was his actual name, he suggested to Boone that they should go out west to take advantage of the gold rush going on at that time. However, Chute would try to back out and decide he didn't want to go. This decision made Boone furious, and he decided he was going to kill him. Unfortunately, Boone would go through with his plan to murder Chute, and he would stab him. After this, Boone would start traveling towards the west, but on the way there, Chute's brother would find him, capture him, and then turn him into the authorities. After being turned in, Boone would be sent to an asylum for people who were mentally deranged. While staying there, Boone would manipulate a security guard into thinking he could trust him, and the guard would let Boone escape the asylum. After escaping, Boone would continue his path out west. On his way to California, it is believed that Boone would fight men with weapons, and this would actually lead to these men's death. It is unknown how many people Boone killed on his way to California, but at this point it is clear that he had a desire to kill. However, miners would find out about these killings, and they wanted to kill Boone, so this would cause him to flee the west. Boone would head out east, and on his way there, he would get companions. Now, Boone and his group decided that they were going to head from Salt Lake City all the way to Fort Hall, Idaho, which is about 178.8 miles away. However, on their way there, they would be hit with harsh winter conditions. Despite this, though, they would continue on until they made it to Van Neck River. There, they would be attacked by Native Americans, and they would chase them until the men were lost and didn't know where they were at. At this point, their horses were exhausted, and this would lead to them killing their horses. At this point, everyone in the group gave up except for Boone and a man named Burton. The two would find an abandoned cabin, and Burton would go in to rest. Boone, however, would try to go find somewhere else to get food, but he would eventually give up and then go back to the cabin. Once he got back, though, it turns out that Burton had committed suicide. After seeing this, Boone would proceed to eat the leg off of the body. After he ate the leg, he continued on until he found an Indian camp. A man by the name of John Powell found Boone and took him in. He gave him food and clothes and sent him to some reservations out in Salt Lake City. So basically, he was back where he started. While in Salt Lake City, though, he killed 2 more men. But after this, people wanted to harm him for killing these 2 men, so he decided he would try to go back out to California. Once he arrived in California, he would befriend a man who owned a ranch. This man took him into his home to take care of him. However, Boone would gain his trust, and he would eventually kill the rancher. After this, he would travel to Oregon, and he would do the same thing, where he robbed and killed multiple men. However, while in Oregon, he was caught for killing a man, but his brother, Old Tex, paid off the witnesses, which caused him to be released from prison. Boone would go to Texas and end up killing more men. Finally, though, Boone would be in Montana where he was arrested, and he wouldn't be released this time. Boone had the smartest idea and said that he hadn't killed anyone, even though at this point he's probably killed hundreds of people. This claim didn't work, and Boone was sentenced to death. Boone would be hanged on January 14th, 1864. It is still unknown how many people Boone had killed. John Wesley Hardin was born on May 26, 1853, in Boone Helm, Texas, to his parents James and Elizabeth. To say the least, John's behavior as a kid was violent. When he was only 14 years old, he had a fight with a student at a school, which led to him stabbing the student. A year later, when he was 15 years old, he had already committed his first murder. He reportedly got into a fight with an African-American man, and John decided to shoot and kill him. Obviously, the police would go to find and arrest him, but he would flee to Sumter, Texas, where his brother lived. According to John, in 1868 and 1869, he killed 4 soldiers who were trying to arrest him. 2 years later, John decided he wanted to travel on the Chisholm Trail. While traveling, though, he killed 10 more people, and after these murders, he would return to Gonzales Country, Texas. However, his desires for murder wouldn't end, and he would end up killing 4 more people until he turned himself in. Eventually, in October 1872, which is only a month after he was arrested, he broke out. After he broke out in 1873 to 1874, he proceeded to get involved in the Sutton-Taylor feud, which is another rabbit hole to go down. I googled it, and I got this short summary of which it says, the Sutton-Taylor feud began as a county law enforcement issue between relatives of a Texas state law agent, Creed Taylor, and a local law enforcement officer, William Sutton, in DeWitt County, Texas. The feud cost at least 35 lives and eventually included the outlaw John Wesley Hardin as one of its participants. It is reported that during the feud, John and a man by the name of Jim Taylor were responsible for the death of Jack Helm, who was a lawman and a former police captain. In May of 1874, John would be in Comanche, Texas, and while there he would end up killing the sheriff Charles Webb. After this, he fled out of Texas to Florida because of the multiple murders he committed. John was living in Florida under a fake name when he was arrested on July 23, 1877 by Texas law enforcement. He was charged with the murder of Charles Webb and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. While in prison, though, he would try to escape but fail. However, he would begin to study law, and for some reason he wrote an autobiography, which was published a year after his death. Now, because he began to study law, he was able to get a license to practice law, which meant he was released from prison. He would be released on March 16, 1894. After this, John moved to El Paso to set up a law practice. However, soon after this move, his desires for murder would return. He would begin having an affair with one of his client's wives. The client's name is Martin Meraz, and at the time he had fled to Mexico to avoid jail time for being a cattle thief. However, once he found out about the affair, he would leave Mexico to go confront John about the affair. However, once he crossed into the United States, he was killed by law officials, which were hired by John to kill Martin. On August 19th, 1895, John was in a saloon talking to one of the officers, John Selman, who was part of the assassination of Martin. Apparently, Selman began arguing with John about not getting paid for the murder, which led to Selman shooting John and killing him. Selman was not charged with the murder and passed away on April 6, 1896. John would be buried at Concordia Cemetery in El Paso.